Bigfoot is about the search for questions of a big nature, looking for important answers to those big questions. This question came to me. I didn't pick it. I was asked to answer it when my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 15 years ago. I couldn't think of a better place to be than Silicon Valley. It's a place where people think big. They aspire to change the world, to invent things that are going to have a big impact on society. And I have that objective as well, but I have it in a very personal way. So 15 years ago, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I didn't really know what that was, so the doctor had to explain it to me. And what it meant was he was dying. However, there was a way to keep him alive. It was to take this drug called insulin and administer it to him on a daily basis. It could keep him alive, but it was kind of tricky. There was no fixed dose for this drug. In fact, you would need to calculate a bunch of things in the environment, food consumed, his stress level, activity levels, changing insulin sensitivity across the day, and actually come up with a unique dose at various points of the day and basically become the doctor that was titrating this very dangerous drug. And I was told, don't give too much of it because you could literally kill your son, render him unconscious, and he could die. Over the long term, you give too little, he might be subject to amputation or blindness or kidney failure, all these nasty things. And I'm just a parent. I'm given these tools, literally insulin and needles. I was given a logbook to write down numbers for glucose readings and how much insulin I was giving, and a hand-drawn sliding scale that was the best technology that I could access in order to make these important decisions. And this was in the best care center in New York City, where we had just moved and my son was 2 weeks into a new school. So this was the best that the world had to offer, and I found it pretty appalling. I had just come out of some exciting businesses where I thought we were changing the world, and then I got thrown into what I thought was the dark ages of healthcare. So since that time, I've actually been on a journey, a pretty important journey for my family and for my son, in order to see that technology is better applied to this problem, dosing this dangerous drug. This is, I believe, the epicenter of digital health, because there's no more data-driven disease than insulin-dependent diabetes. It requires that you actually collect a lot of data, do a lot of calculations, make a lot of decisions. These are things that computers do rather well, and they have not been employed to solve this problem. Real people do this. It's not the doctor who actually is deciding. It is the average person of average education, income, access to healthcare, average people. And the average person hates math. This is not a good situation. And the people who are living with this disease, they're literally treated by primary care providers for the most part. This data, which we just bought a couple weeks ago, literally proves what I always knew, that there aren't enough endocrinologists to actually see the patients for type 1 diabetes, let alone also the increasing number of type 2. Primary care providers are basically writing prescriptions for people who are their own doctor titrating this medicine on a daily basis. So 15 years later, where are we? This is the standard of care. This is the best thing that you can do today. This product is just now being introduced. It is, and I don't mean to understate it, this will save some people's lives. It has some intelligence in it, some ability to sense glucose and have feedback such that you can help to protect against hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. But it is what it looks like. It is a piece of hospital equipment that was fundamentally developed in a medical device mindset. It's very complicated. And so there are only a few hundred doctors in the world who would dare to prescribe it and know how to support it in a confident way. And there are only a handful of patients that are able to use it effectively. It is not a consumer device. And for this disease, that's what you need. You need a consumer device or a system that is going to help a real person to dose a very dangerous drug. So you might ask, what does consumerization mean in medical device? This is the idea of consumerization. You put a sticker on it, or you put a case around it. It would be funny if it were not true. And it's not that these people are stupid. These are very smart people who've worked very hard to try and solve a real problem, but this is a hard thing to do. Consumerization in medical device, especially this kind of medical device, is very difficult. This is our idea of consumerization. Living where people live, which is the phone. This device is the most effective, most impactful human-machine interface ever developed in history. There's nothing that rivals an iPhone and an iOS in terms of taking a human being, interfacing with a powerful machine. The fact that this is not the primary interface for any chronic disease management system is a crime. It's not today for type 1 diabetes. In fact, that device I just showed you a minute ago, it does not talk to the phone. And there are very good reasons why it doesn't. Security is a very important part of the equation. In fact, the lack of security for the existing insulin pumps is why we're in business. My co-founder, about 4.5 years ago, he actually hacked into an existing insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor, and he hooked them both up to the phone, and he brought some machine learning algorithms to automatically dose insulin for his wife and his son, both of whom have type 1 diabetes. So for the last 4 years, their lives have been fundamentally transformed by hacking into existing medical devices and connecting them up to the grid, so to speak. This exists, it's just not a product that anybody sells. There are now 300 people around the world who have followed his lead and hacked into their existing medical devices and created smarter systems than you can buy from anybody. This is a hard problem to solve. Let me explain a little bit why. Well, it's not just an app. The app is the least of what you're doing here. You're tying together medical devices, and in this case, what are called class 3 medical devices, into a system. So the thing that we have to show to the FDA and actually submit is all this stuff here. So a continuous glucose monitor, an insulin pump that infuses insulin 24 hours a day and is connected. These are the ambulatory devices. A blood glucose monitor so that you can prick your finger every once in a while as a diagnostic to make sure the system is still operating properly or to calibrate the sensor. The app on the phone, even part of the cloud, is a class 3 medical device because that's where we have the initialization settings. That's where if your pump breaks and you need a new one, in fact, you're going to have those downloaded from the cloud so you don't have to reset it up. Also firmware over-the-air upgrades, which have to come from the cloud. All that gets submitted to the FDA, whether we make it or not, and some of these are licensed components. This is a very challenging task for a small company, a startup. Class 3 medical devices are usually surgical robots or cardiac implants. There is not much that startup companies do in class 3 medical device, or if they do, they only do the early stages of it and then they sell it off to a big medical device company. There's not much precedent for what we're doing, which is a consumer-focused medical device that requires clinical trials, class 3, at the highest level of regulatory scrutiny. Most people want to play in the bottom 2 bars here, which is either unregulated apps or 510K devices, which means you don't have to actually test it on a person in order to prove that it's safe and effective. It's more about paperwork and bench testing. In fact, there were 25 class 3 medical devices that were approved last year. Only one of them had anything remotely to do with a consumer who would use it. The others are used by medical professionals, credentialed professionals with training that is ongoing, people who actually read manuals. The one I showed you earlier, that insulin pump, that was the only one. Investors are really interested in non-regulated businesses for reasons I can completely understand. People have lost a lot of money by having to go to the FDA, making some mistaken assumptions about what the FDA would think, how easy it would be, how big the clinical trial would be, how long it would have to be, what you'd have to prove. There are a lot of train wrecks that you can actually point to and say, this is a risky thing. Investors are not so interested. It is a very tough space to fund a company. It's a very tough space in which to operate because you need a lot of specialized expertise that most startups can't bring to the picture. I think I've crossed the Grand Canyon of death. People talk about the Valley of Death. The Valley of Death for health startups, for medical startups, translational research that's just, it needs a little help to get to a pre-commercial stage where investors will be interested in investing in it. This is more what I crossed over the first 2 years of our company's existence. I can tell you, I went up and down Sand Hill Road and talked to all the traditional medical device investors, and they basically said, you are exactly the things that we don't want to invest in. We don't do class 3 medical devices anymore, just too risky. Can't you do an app? I said, I could do an app, but it just wouldn't solve this problem. We need to do more. They didn't want to invest in diabetes, and that seems kind of silly, right? Everybody talks about diabetes. It's the biggest problem we have, but people have lost a lot of money in diabetes, especially medical devices. The blood glucose test strip industry is imploding for Johnson & Johnson and Roche and Bayer and all these other companies that used to be on the top of the world. Now that they get pennies on the dollar for those test strips, it's a bad business. Insulin pump companies. Actually, we bought an insulin pump company. $150 million invested over 10 years. We bought them for 5. Because, in fact, they went out of business. They didn't have a solution to a problem. They had a technology, and there's a lot of wreckage in diabetes. And then when you add on top of it that I need $100 billion in order to get to market, that's pretty much unfundable. Except we did fund it. We're on the other side of that canyon. Raised about $50 million to date. And we did it because we weren't actually funding a medical device. We're funding a solution to a problem. And that solution is a device, or in fact, a bunch of different devices. And those devices need to be tied together with software that is made to fit hand in glove with those devices. And then going further, disrupting the way it's sold, it's a service. People are not looking to buy durable medical equipment. That's not what a consumer wants. That's what a doctor wants for a doctor's office or a hospital wants for an emergency room. What people want is a solution to a problem, and that's what we're going to sell them. Or more importantly, we're going to sell to the payer. Because the payer wants a solution to a problem, but they want to pay as they go. They want to actually tie what they pay to outcomes, and that's the business that we're building. So it turns out in order to do what we wanted to do for our children, wanted to do for people who have this disease, requires a lot of change, a lot of innovation. It's a lot of stuff to do in a very small package. Sorry. You have to actually solve for 3 competencies, major competencies. Being able to do consumer stuff is a very different thing than what medical device companies have done or what healthcare companies have done historically. It is what Silicon Valley does, but they're not used to doing it in an enterprise or regulated space. You also have to do enterprise strength security because you're talking about people's health. You're talking about information about their lives that literally these devices are supporting their life, health, and safety. But then you need to do it in front of the FDA. You have to be able to manufacture class 3 medical devices. You have to be able to vet all your suppliers that are actually supplying parts for class 3 medical devices. And then you have to go through clinical trials and you have to do regulatory filings. These are a lot of competencies for a startup to have to wrestle with, and there are very few precedents for that. So we're proud that we think we're creating a new kind of company that actually is about as broad in terms of its competencies that you could possibly imagine for the number of people we have, which is about 50 now, to be able to cover consumer-grade design and industrial design and user experience, to be able to do cybersecurity and data science and machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, to be able to do all that stuff that Silicon Valley knows so well, but also do the less sexy stuff over on the right-hand side, which is the administrative challenges of a quality system, which is basically a lot of paperwork that documents every decision and every thought you ever had with regard to your product. the quality systems and the clinical trials and the regulatory filings. All of that requires some very specific competencies that are very expensive and time-consuming and slow to actually process in the system. These are hard companies to build, but we're very proud to say that we have done it. Look at the range of competencies that are required. You have to have people from companies that make radiation robots, infusion mechanisms, diagnostics, but you also have to have people who understand this particular disease because it is very specific and peculiar in terms of how much the consumer owns it and lives with it. You have to have the traditional technology competencies of embedded software, of app development, of cloud systems, the design competencies, and then we have to understand the science because we're still actually taking new, novel concepts that are really fundamentally going to change how patients live with the disease. This is a lot of stuff. You also have to arrange it, the technology that is, in a very smart way. What you have to do for this kind of problem is you have to separate the stuff that takes tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars from the stuff that you can do in a number of weeks and roll out on your server on a Saturday. And in between, you have things here on the left-hand side, an insulin pump. That takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years to develop. You have to make sure it's accurate and reliable. You have to do biocompatibility of insulin with plastics. That's a lot of stuff. It takes a long time. If I'd have had to do that, it would have taken us, if we'd have been amazingly competent and very targeted in our efforts, $50 million and 5 years. This company spent more like $150 million in 10 years. We were able to get that for $5 million, license some other components, and then just focus on the smarts of the system. But the smarts of the system didn't also come with that screen and the interface. Because why do I want to build an interface? I want to use the best human-machine interface that exists, which is the phone. But this is a hard problem to solve. You actually have to think about security in a new way. The token for cybersecurity purposes needs to be issued when that pump is manufactured. There needs to be a cloud system that does authentication. They all actually meet in the phone, which is the weakest part of the link. It is a very fragile device. When you're playing Angry Birds and it reboots, you also have to have a continual flow of insulin, and you have to be safe. Actually blending these medical device and consumer technologies, I believe, is the future opportunity for all of us, and it is what we were engaged in doing today. But it is hard, and it does require some significant breadth of capabilities that, again, very difficult for a small company. So I'm going to end with where Bigfoot began, which is our mission, and it's very much focused on the users of these tools. I think I can adequately and confidently state that we're doing consumerification as much as anybody because we start with the person who lives with the disease. We say, let's put technology in service of those folks. This is a hard thing to do, but it's necessary to solve the problem, and we're doing it. When I look at a customer who's happy, one who says that they had to have it pried out of their hands in the clinical trial because it was so transformational to their life, health, and safety and the sense of wellness and well-being, this is a satisfied customer. And I'm happy to be able to tell you about it today. This is why I believe in Bigfoot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And here's your bottle of bread and butter wine and Magic Box Paradigm, your book. And a quick question, because we have, I believe we have 3 or 4 companies in our startup competition that are facing this chasm of I'm assuming the chasm is the regulatory, the clinical trials and the FDA approval. That's part of it. That's a big part of it, correct?
Actually, I think the biggest chasm is the capital to fund Class 3 medical device businesses in the consumer space, or if you're focused on the clinical environment, people don't like Class 3. The FDA has made a lot of changes in the last few years. I was very fortunate to, before the 4 years before starting this company, I was the CEO of a nonprofit foundation that worked directly with the FDA to write the guidance for how clinical testing is done to prove safety and efficacy for these systems. So the patient perspective can be very influential in influencing the FDA. And the FDA is very open to collaboration these days. They want to win. They realize that technology is changing. There's possibilities for innovation. It's just that they're in a difficult position. Too slow, too fast, they lose both ways.
So the chasm is convincing a lot of these VCs that they should be investing early, even before these approvals, and even though it's going to be, they're going to need $100 million to really get this to the market. What's your advice to those companies as they're trying to raise these funds?
Focus on solutions that solve problems that are commercially valuable. Making an insulin pump that makes life a little more convenient for the patient is a great thing. I love it for my son. It's not a business. You actually have to have a healthcare economic outcome that payers will pay for in order to build a business in this space. So focus on the customer and what they want to pay for.
Great, thanks. Have a model. Thank you,
Thank you.
Jeffrey. Okay, everyone.